you won't be recorded unless you're speaking, so it shouldn't be a problem. But yeah, just to let you know. So just to introduce you to Jane and Chris, who really kindly joined our call today. So first of all, would you like to introduce yourselves? Perhaps Jane, would you like to start?
Yeah, sure. Hello, everyone. I'm Jane Baston. I'm currently the co-chair of the Young Greens. I was formerly doing Vic and Sophie's role last year, but I am also formerly a sabbatical officer. So I was the Vice President Academic at the University of York Graduate Students Association, which is one of the only postgraduate student unions in the country. And I did that role for 2 years, from 2019 to 2021. So right throughout the start of the pandemic, and then through to sort of the vague weirdness that we're in now, where it's still technically happening, but we're kind of sort of ignoring it a little bit. But yeah, very excited to be here. Thank you all for coming.
Chris, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, firstly, thanks so much for having me. So I am Chris. I'm a Green City Councillor in Oxford, still just about a Young Green. And many moons ago, I was a sabbatical officer at UEA from 2014 to 2016, which shows my age a little. Yeah, that's me.
Lovely. So perhaps just to start us off, just wondering, so how did you find out about this role and why did you want to get involved? So whoever wants to start first, like, feel free to jump in.
Chris and I are just going to awkwardly sit in silence and stare at each other now. I'm happy to go first on that one. Yeah, so I came to York for my master's. And became an academic rep, which I'd done throughout my undergrad as well. So was sort of like vaguely involved in the union by that point. I think the most engagement I'd had was sort of them buying pizza for a rep meeting, which is always great. Pizza always works very well. And then sort of the elections came up and I saw the advertisements for it and got the email about it and had sort of like a read through the roles. And because I'd been an academic rep and I'd been doing work in my department on some sort of academic issues and working with other people as well that I knew, I considered running the vice president academic, and sort of changed my mind a lot. I think I submitted the application like the Friday evening or something like that, like 24 hours before the deadline or something, very, very close to the deadline, because I couldn't decide if I wanted to do it or not. But I think the thing that kind of pushed me on was the fact that I had some things that I wanted to change about the university and the way that it was doing things. And I thought, why not? Why shouldn't I try and change things? And then obviously in my second year, when I reran, there was a pandemic on at that point. And I think I sort of felt a weird sense of like obligation towards the students, in the sense that I didn't want to abandon them to the chaos. But also I knew what the university was doing. I knew how it worked. And by that point, I felt that I knew that I could go into a meeting and pinpoint the problems and tell the university where they were probably screwing things up and where they could improve things. And that was what I wanted to keep doing, particularly in the middle of a pandemic when it's more important than ever that students have their voices represented. So that was kind of why I ran first year and second year.
Yeah, I think so. So for me, I'd been kind of quite heavily engaged in various kind of student campaigns, and also within the Students' Union prior to standing in the elections. So the first kind of involvement I'd had was around campaigning for the living wage for students on campus. Not students on campus, sorry, staff on campus. And that first kind of started with the fact that the student union still wasn't paying the living wage. And so it was very difficult for students to be campaigning towards the university to get them to pay their staff a living wage when the union themselves weren't doing it. So I was involved with a group of other students in pushing for the students' union first to pay the living wage. We won that battle, and then was involved in a series of other campaigns through the union and outside of it. At the time, the year before I was elected, there was quite I don't know how to put this, but there was quite a lot of turmoil in the union, in that we just had a new chief executive appointed, who went about a restructure which was going to lead to 30 full-time members of staff being made redundant. So I was heavily involved in the campaign that students were running to save the jobs of the student union staff, and to stop the cuts in staff there. And so it became quite clear at that point that without changing the leadership of the union, we weren't going to win campaigns like that and ensure that the union itself was a decent employer and wasn't undermining its own staff, but also that it was a radical campaigning force for wider change on campus and across the rest of Norwich. And so I guess my involvement came sort of prior, before the election, and then was very much driven by trying to radicalize the union and then to use the institution to fight for wider change.
Lovely, thank you so much for that. So also wanted to ask you, what would you have liked to know before you applied to these elections? What actually you think would have helped us?
I can jump in first on this one. I guess there's two aspects, right? There's the election campaign itself and fighting and winning that, and then there's the weird and wonderful world of student politics more generally. I think in terms of the election campaign, there's a load of stuff that would have been hugely helpful, and maybe we can delve into it in more detail as we talk later. But I think the biggest thing would have been the scale of a student union campaign can be vast, and the amount of time and energy that needs to put in. It varies from campus to campus. Some campuses have SU elections where there is one candidate for each position and that person wins. There are some campuses where there are 9 candidates for each position and you are spending sort of 16 hours a day campaigning. UEA is somewhere in the middle, but it was still really fucking intense. And having kind of a clear understanding of what that is and what that means for your degree, and also your mental health and having and physical health, and having the ability to put kind of support structures in place and a campaign team in place that will enable you to run that election effectively and win it in a way that doesn't destroy you, would have been helpful. I guess in terms of the student union itself, I think my biggest piece of advice to anyone who is a new sabbatical officer or standing for election is to remember that a students' union and the student movement is designed to serve the interests of students, and there are vast kind of numbers of individuals and kind of cultures within the student movement that basically seek to undermine that very purpose, and often that comes in the form of kind of external things like your interactions with the university or with kind of other stakeholders. It often will come internally from within the students' union itself, from sort of management and staff. It will come from institutions like NUS, and these things intersect, right? So the student union staff and managers, a lot of them are ex-sabbatical officers at previous students' unions. A lot of them have had their staff training from the NUS or from other bits of the HE sector. And so you have essentially a bureaucracy that is kind of deeply conservative when it comes to the student movement. And that is a big challenge to take on as a 21-year-old. But I think one thing that I think is really important is that you ground yourself in the fact that the structure of a students' union puts, or should put, depending on how fucked your constitution is and how much power has been grabbed by other parts of the institution, but should be directed and steered and led by students through elected student officers or through whatever democratic structures you have, and holding to that very clearly. And that's actually very similar to my experience as a councillor, because councils have vast bureaucracies that are unelected, and trying to steer them from the democratic side of the organization is challenging, but remembering that's what you're there to do, and it is a battle and it is hard. And I guess, yeah, not expecting sort of, I mean, the biggest thing that I found was, I mean, we had a series of kind of left-wing candidates who got elected, and we kind of naively were like, well, we get elected, then we control the infrastructure and bureaucracy, and we win, and we do the things you want to do. But actually, all the battle comes after the election, when you're trying to steer an organization and institution that is like fundamentally hostile to your politics and that change. And kind of coming into it with an understanding that that's the case, I think, is really helpful in terms of enabling you to identify the kind of the approach that you're able to take as an officer in steering the organization.
Thank you very much for that. I don't know if Jane's here. Wait, sorry. Yeah.
I'm still here. Yes, I was just getting up to grab a book, which Chris.
No worries. Yeah, you take your time. We can skip to the next question if you.
No, we're fine. I'm back. So yeah, I think I really agree with everything that Chris said. The election period is incredibly difficult. My second year, when I was standing for re-election, I probably wouldn't have survived it without one of my housemates, who used to drag me out of my room and stop me from doing social media things, because it was all online, because we were in lockdown. And it's really important to have those connections, and kind of remember why you're doing it as well, and kind of what you want to achieve from it. So self-care is important, I think, is the outcome of that, but also kind of being very clear on your priorities. So when you're writing a manifesto, I've always stuck with like 3 big things, because that gets your message across. In terms of the SU itself, yes, very much agree with Chris. You are fighting internally and externally. One of the books that I think was really helpful for me is this one, which is Student Revolt, Voices of the Austerity Generation, which Chris originally recommended, I think, to me, and then I've just recently finished reading. Would highly recommend it, because it gives a really detailed kind of insight into the 2010 student movement, which Chris was part of. I think you were part of it, right, Chris?
No, I mean, I was just after that generation, so that I kind of surfed the final bit of the wave of student radicalism then, but it was very much a depleting force by the time that I was kind of active in the student.
Yeah, and I think it really kind of, because I'd been sort of throughout my 2 years as a sabbatical officer kind of reckoning with the fact that SUs have become relatively like neoliberal. Like Chris was saying, they're conservative in nature. They want to conserve the student movement, but they're also relatively neoliberal. And I think that book in particular really kind of highlights that and makes you kind of see through the glare sometimes that happens when you come into an SU role in any shape or form. And I think that's really important, especially when you meet your senior management team of your student union and of your university, and they're like, oh, it's amazing to have you here. We're so excited to have you improve the student experience. And then 2 years later, you realize that you've essentially just become a student experience consultant. And that means that they're trying to limit you from making any form of radical change. And that's really difficult to fight against, especially when you don't realize that it's happened. So yeah, being aware of that is really important. And I think the other thing as well is, as Chris was saying, is remembering why you're there. You're there to represent the students, to make changes for the students. And if you're lucky, you'll be in a student union that sets you up to do that. I very much wasn't. We barely had a constitution. We didn't have any bylaws. When I started, we had no real democracy. And then we managed to kind of reform that throughout my 2 years. And learning how that works, learning how your democratic process works, your reps, your student council, or whatever it's called, how you make policy, all those types of things, which you might already be involved in, you might already know about, but knowing how to navigate that process, knowing how where kind of the trigger points are, how you can get things through that, is also really powerful to kind of understand that, and recognizing who the enemy within is, whether that's your student union CEO who gets his salary and everybody else's salary from your university, or your university senior management who don't really want you to be making noise about things on campus, is really difficult, but it's also really important, and kind of figuring out that beforehand. So yeah, I think those are the big things I'd want to know. Obviously, pandemics didn't know there was going to be a pandemic, which I think is the other thing as well. Like, knowing your priorities when you come in is really important. So you write your manifesto, you want to do certain things, and then you get elected and you get given this whole info dump throughout about a month. And then you have to kind of reevaluate because there's all of this stuff that you didn't know. And the university is putting pressure on you to do things. The SU is putting pressure on you to do things. The students will be doing that as well. And it's about kind of figuring out what are the things that you can achieve, what are the things that you can get done, what are the things that you want to get done as well. And that's really difficult because there's so many. It's a list that you could spend 24 hours a day working on, but figuring out which bits are the important bits, which bits are the important meetings, is difficult, but a really important part of it as well. So I think those are probably the things I would have wanted to have known beforehand. And obviously doing 2 years as a sabbatical officer is something that in your second year, you very much know a lot of that, which can often help. But not everybody chooses to do a second year because it's also a very intense job.
Thank you very much. You've touched on how hard the election process can be and just running a campaign. Just wanted to just a quick question on what was your support network during this process? Like, who do you sort of rely on and who was supporting you along the way? And also if you had any people that you looked up to during that process, like any mentors during that time or people that would give you advice?
Yeah, I can kick off on this. I think just partially reflecting on kind of the election campaigns that I ran, but also on other campaigns I was involved with. I think one thing I would say is that it's really important to have a solid campaign team that plays to your strengths. So if you are not somebody who can do graphic design, find someone who can do graphic design. If you are not someone who is able to do video editing, find someone who can do video editing. If you are not someone who kind of has a comprehensive understanding of your campus, find people who can talk to you about the different bits of the campus. So for example, your experience as a student, wherever you are, will be specific to your experience as a student, and it won't be reflective of however people interact with your university. So if you're say an English student, you will probably only interact with the bit of the campus where you have your lectures, where you go to have a coffee, where you go to the library, where you if you've got an SU bar, where you're in the bar. Whereas there'll be other students on your campus, say for example science students, who will frequent an entirely different bit of the campus. And when you're doing an election campaign, it's really important to remember that your experience of the campus isn't universal, and to understand where other students are physically on campus. So for example, at UEA, we had a nursing school which is on a completely different site. Now, if you don't know a nurse, then you'll never have been to that site. You'll never even know about that site. You'll think that site doesn't exist and you think it's unimportant, but actually they have their own entire canteen, cafes, social spaces, where if you're the candidate that goes and campaigns there because you're the one that knows about it, you're going to win over those voters and nobody else's. Similarly, at UEA, there's cafes in the science department which art students don't spend any time in, and so finding people who can give you advice as to the experience of different students is really, really important. I think the other thing I'd say is depending on the nature of your university, different kind of campaign tactics will be particularly useful. So for UEA, where I was campaigning, almost all the halls of residence are on campus. And so a huge part of the election campaigns that I was involved in was basically door knocking halls of residence, and spending a huge amount of time doing door knocking. Now, having people in my campaign team who are willing to come door knocking each evening of the campaign meant that we were able to cover the whole. So in my campaign, we've got around every door twice in our door knocking operation. I never did door knocking alone for two reasons. One, because it's really fucking boring. And if you're spending sort of 3 hours an evening on your own talking to people who don't really want to talk to you, it's nice to have a friend with you. But also because, and this will apply to different people differently. But if you knock on a door and it's a flat of like all like women, and you're knocking on a door at 9 o'clock and you look like I do, you're much more intimidating and unfriendly than somebody if you're door knocking with somebody else who's a woman or someone who doesn't look like I do. And so thinking about bringing in different people in your campaign team to be effective to communicate to different voters, I think is really important. The one most important thing I'd say for an election campaign is find someone you know who can cook for you. Because when I was running for election, I'd be on campus sort of 12, 14 hours a day campaigning, and then you get home at sort of 10:30 in the evening, and the last thing you want to fucking do is cook. So if you've got someone who can cook for you, it just makes everything so much easier. And you won't be spending money on like takeaways. You'll like get decent food, which like is important. And yeah, if you can find someone as part of your campaign team to do that, I would say that's the most important role, is someone who can like make you a wholesome meal when you're like back from the freezing cold and pissing rain in February, having knocked on loads of doors and are feeling miserable. Coming home to something delicious is definitely a boost.
I just have to say Chris says that because he's a wonderful cook and always just cooking for election campaigning stuff. Yeah, I'm not going to rehash what Chris has said, mainly because I didn't do any campaigning in my first year when I got elected, because I had an assignment, really big assignment, due like literally the day that the election finished. And I was also on a campus that is the other side of the city from the main campus, and therefore couldn't get there, which was great fun. So I won almost purely by chance because, well, the other candidate annoyed everybody somehow, and I got elected because people liked me and knew of me. So it's really different depending on your campus, on the demographic of the students as well. And then obviously my second year was all online. And I think the biggest thing with that I would say is scheduling non-social media time, scheduling time where you are not responding to messages, where you're not scheduling posts in, where you're not designing your graphics or working with your graphic designer if you have one, because that time away is really, really important, because an election campaign is just so like all consuming. It just consumes everything in your life, as Chris was saying, with the 16 or so hours a day, and it's important to kind of have half an hour to step back from that. In terms of support, obviously, I had friends on campus who were kind of helping me out and talking to their friends as well and saying, my friend is running in these elections, vote for her, she's great, this is what she's standing on and everything like that. And then that very much worked again online as well. Getting people to share things is really important, whether it's Twitter or Facebook or Instagram, whatever you're using. And we might come back to social media a bit later, because obviously that's become a lot bigger since Chris was standing, and it was something that I used a lot. And there was something else I was going to say now and I've completely forgotten it. Oh yeah, so the other thing as well that I found was that talking to other former sabbatical officers, so the people who had stood in the elections and were currently elected, but also when I restood in my second year, my whole sabbatical officer team restood, and we didn't stand on a slate because we weren't allowed to and we didn't want to, but talking with them and saying, I'm just so drained today, everything seems terrible, having someone to kind of talk to up until the point where you get told the elections was really useful for me as well. So yeah, that's probably what I'd say on campaigning.
Lovely, thank you so much for that. Just one more question before we open the board, so like everyone can ask questions. Just quickly, why did you think it's important to have left-wing candidates in these positions?
I can go first. I think that the student movement has historically been at the forefront of basically most major social and political changes we've seen in the last 150 years, whether it be supporting the playing like a major role in the battle for African American civil rights, or whether it's the opposition to the Vietnam War in the 1960s, or whether it's the anti-austerity movement, and the kind of the upsurge in kind of contemporary kind of feminism after the from 2012 onwards. The student movement is like a major driver of social and political change, not just in like the West, but the fall of totalitarianism in Eastern Europe was driven by the student movement, and workers' rights movements in China now are led by student activists and student workers. And so the only reason why those things have been able to happen is because we've had radical left-wing people elected inside student unions and within the student movement, and having full-time paid organisers, which I think is how you should see yourself as a sabbatical officer, is really vital for like winning battles for student rights and for economic justice for students, but also for driving wider social and political change. The conversation on climate has moved so much in the last 8 years, and a huge part of that is down to the fact that students starting in the US, moving over to the UK, and then spreading across the rest of the world, took on the fossil fuel industry through the divestment movement. That has birthed a kind of whole new generation of climate activists. It shifted the dial on the conversation around climate in such a huge way. And also the people that are involved in struggles like the divestment movement 8 years ago are now also really, really crucial people and organisers in other aspects of kind of social movements. And the kind of the radicalization process of being and the politicization and the political education you get from being a student organizer enables you to be a more effective organizer and drive more change later on down the line. So basically the short answer is the reason why we need left-wing sabbatical officers, the reason why we need left-wing student unions, the reason why we need the left to be kind of driving the student movement is because without the student movement, we don't win those kind of major social and political changes that we've seen over the last 150 years anywhere near as quickly. Obviously, those kind of examples that I've mentioned include the trade union movement, they include faith groups, they include huge other aspects of society, but the thread that runs throughout them is so often the student movement, and that doesn't happen unless you have the left organising and active within students' unions, within student movement. So for me, it's kind of crucial in terms of driving wider political change, and without it, we're fucked, basically. Yeah.
I'm not sure how I top that. I'm not quite sure how I go after that, other than to say I agree. I think it's really important to have left-wing people in those places, because university is a place where a lot of people get radicalized, particularly at the moment, because of the just horrendous shit that's happening on a lot of campuses, whether that's Manchester caging in their students, or Liverpool sacking loads of people, or Sheffield shutting down the whole of their Department of Archaeology. There's a lot of kind of really terrible stuff that's being driven by high level management, because they are pushing towards a much more marketized view of higher education, and they want sabbatical officers that they're going to be able to kind of push around a little bit, that they're going to be able to use as student experience consultants, like I said, and we really need people in there who are going to help students as they get radicalized, as they realize that actually this is not what education is supposed to be, and it's not what society is supposed to be, and we can make it into something better. And having left-wing people in those leadership spaces, pushing for big change, providing those organizing spaces with resources, with support standing behind them is really, really important. And obviously there's more UCU strikes coming up as well, and it's really important that we have as many students and student unions standing in solidarity with them. There have been a number which haven't over the past sort of year or couple of years, which is always infuriating, because the things that student unions are fighting for, that students are fighting for, and that our lecturers, our academics, those in UCU are fighting for is exactly the same thing. And not having that level of solidarity is really frustrating. So yeah, I can't really top Chris, but it's important, and I think that's why.
Thank you so much to you too. So now please feel free to